Hi everyone. Since it is 12 o'clock, we're going to get started. So some folks joining, but I am just going to start with some brief housekeeping. My name is Lacey. I am the Administrative and Program Coordinator for the California Association of Museums. We're really grateful that you're joining us today, and I'm very grateful to our speakers as well. Just a couple reminders before we begin. This webinar is being recorded. Live captioning is available, and I'll be sending the link in the chat box, and I'll continue to do so as more people join us so that everyone can access the captioning. Our presenters will answer questions at the end of their presentation, and we encourage you to send your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any technical issues, please feel free to message me using the chat box, or you can send me an email at admin@calmuseums.org. And now I'm going to pass it off to Tomoko Kuta, who is the chair of CAM's program committee. Thank you.
So I want to welcome everyone and kick off today's presentation with a land acknowledgement. As we begin this event, we acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions. A land acknowledgement is a critical step towards working with Native communities to secure a meaningful partnership and inclusion in the stewardship and protection of their cultural resources and homelands. Our institutions were founded upon exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples. We honor and are grateful for the land we occupy and recognize the ongoing damage of settler colonialism. Let's take a moment to honor these ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathered upon and support the resilience and strength that all Indigenous people have shown worldwide. I am on the traditional territory of the Kumeyaay people. I encourage you to name and acknowledge the Native peoples where you are located in the chat box. Please send it to all panelists and attendees in the chat box so that we can all honor the original inhabitants of these lands. For you to find the Native peoples at your location, Lacey has added the nativelands.ca link in the chat box. So now we'll go on to the sponsor. Oh, we're seeing some great responses from everyone. So thank you for sharing. This is really great. I can see the real spread of participants throughout the state of California from all the different Native peoples. Great. So now we'll move on to the sponsor acknowledgement. CAM's free Lunch and Learn webinar program is supported in part by Associated Foundations, Inc. in memory of Barry Herlihy. Live captioning is supported in part by the National Arts and Disability Center at the University of California, Los Angeles, and Ability Central. CAM is supported in part by a grant from the California Arts Council, a state agency. Today's Lunch and Learn program, using a standardized tool to understand the visitor experience, was originally presented as a case study at the CAM 2020 conference in Los Angeles in March. It has been adapted for a webinar format. I am pleased to introduce our speakers for today. Vicki Wawerchak is the Director of Public Programs within the Guest Experience Division at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. She has spent the past 7 years helping guide the organization's feeding narrations, auditorium programs, tours, sleepovers, and seasonal theatrical programs. Her passion includes ensuring public programs are inclusive and accessible. She helped pilot a new format of presentation delivery for blended bilingual Spanish language programming. She has 25 years of marine biology and environmental education experience, designing programs, writing curriculum, managing staff, and teaching in various aquarium facilities, on boats, islands, and in tide pools. She is joined by Jen Rigney today, who has worked at the Monterey Bay Aquarium for the past 7 years as a visitor researcher and currently as the manager of social science research and evaluation. She holds a PhD in developmental psychology from the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she researched children's developing understanding of the living world. As an evaluator, she loves using creative methods to uncover visitors' thoughts and feelings and helping aquarium staff take a data-informed approach to decision-making. Thank you so much to both of you today, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Hi everyone. Vicki and I are excited to share with you all our experiences using a data collection tool called the Dimensions of the Visitor Experience Checklist, or DOVE for short, that we've used at the Monterey Bay Aquarium to help us understand our visitors' cognitive, emotional, sensory, and introspective experiences at our public programs. This tool was developed by Dr. Jan Packer of the University of Queensland in Australia and used by a wide range of cultural institutions, from zoos and aquariums to art museums, natural history museums, you name it. So before we dig into the details of the DOVE, Vicki's going to give us some background on the aquarium and our public programs.
Great, thank you. Yes, in case you haven't heard about the Monterey Bay Aquarium, or if you've never been, I wanted to give you just a quick brief background on us. We opened in 1984, and our mission is to inspire conservation of the ocean. We typically have about 2 million visitors per year, and of course, this is a very non-traditional year for us, but prior to the outbreak, we usually welcome about 2 million visitors, which is pretty incredible. We have nearly 200 galleries and exhibits devoted to the diverse habitats of the Monterey Bay, with the largest exhibit being our open sea exhibit, which houses this green sea turtle, and it's over 1 million gallons. And as a scientific institution, you can imagine how important data is, as well as the evaluation of our work. And we're very fortunate to have an on-site social science research and evaluation team that helps guide our work from exhibits to programs to conservation messaging. And our division, the division that I work under, is the guest experience. And so Jen and I have worked together for the past, 7 years on evaluating every single program that I think we do, which was mentioned are the feeding narrations, auditorium programs, tours, seasonal theatrical programs, and sleepovers. And for us, it's a real great opportunity for us to understand what the guest experience is. So for us, the definition of guest experience that we're trying to impart is an opportunity to increase ocean awareness, to share stories of our animals and exhibits, to of course inspire ocean conservation, and to provide guests with calls to action in order to become stewards of the environment. We accomplish this by numerous touch points and opportunities to interact with staff and volunteers during their visit. And our data has shown from the evaluations that we've done before that when guests come and they actually would see a feeding narration and an auditorium program during their visit, that they scored their visit higher in overall satisfaction. So these public programs are really important to the guest experience. And we also believe as an aquarium that if we engage visitors' hearts and their emotions through these programs and actually help them connect to the animals, our guests are going to be inspired to do more for the ocean. And so being able to measure that impact is where this DOVE tool, the Dimensions of the Visitor Experience, has been extremely helpful. And Jen's going to talk a little bit more about that tool specifically.
Great. So in addition to how the Monterey Bay Aquarium thinks about the guest experience, I wanted to share this theoretical model by Packer and Valentine on how to think about the visitor experience. And this model is what the DOVE is based on. So first I want to draw your attention to the rectangle that says external elements, opportunity for an experience. And those of you in the audience who might be exhibit developers, program developers, those who create social media content, you are creating an opportunity for an experience. You're offering that experience to visitors. And how visitors respond to that offering is going to, of course, depend on the affordances of that offering, those external elements, but also it will differ depending on who visitors are. So visitors might respond differently based on their differing identities, motivations, expectations, background experiences, all those sorts of things. And so it will lead to those immediate subjective experiences that maybe we both intended, that we intentionally set out to elicit when we developed those opportunities. but also perhaps some unintended consequences or things that we hadn't thought about. And that is really what the dove is intended to capture. It casts a really wide net to be able to measure things, a wide range of experiences. So it's measuring that red box, that immediate subjective experience. And we care about that for a number of reasons. One being that it's going to shape what visitors take away from our museum experiences. It's going to shape those things that we really care about that help us achieve our missions. So those things, the remembered experience, the things that visitors are inspired to do when they leave their visit. It's also important to us because it's based on research on satisfying experiences. So this turns out to be the core product of the museum visit, and that immediate subjective experience, the range of things the dove measures, such as fascination and compassion and aesthetic appreciation and excitement. Those are the sorts of things that visitors find satisfying. And then the next slide, I wanted to share the second part of the model, which represents this idea of the visitor experience as a diamond that is multifaceted. So you have these 10 facets that make up the multifaceted experience. And it's to emphasize that, you know, say if any one program is trying to focus on maybe eliciting a sensory or cognitive experience, that's just one facet of something that's multifaceted. And no one program needs to be necessarily touching on all these facets, but the entire experience might want to be touching on many of them, the entire museum experience. And of course, so for different exhibits and programs might be highlighting some of these at certain points. Some might be felt more intensely for some programs and less intensely, but they're kind of this idea that it's a multifaceted experience. So this is what the dove is intending to measure, this wide range of experiences. And if we go to the next slide, this is now getting into the details of the dove. So what you see on the left is the dove instrument adapted to the Monterey Bay Aquarium style. And that is 75 words and phrases that collapse into 15 dimensions. So the dimensions are on the right-hand side. And so each dimension is made up of 5 words. And so what visitors are asked to do is to indicate which of the following words or phrases best describe what they experienced during the program more than they would in their everyday life. And then when we go and score what they checked, there's a maximum score of 5 for each dimension. So for instance, the fascination dimension is made up of the words, I felt fascinated, I felt amazed, I felt intrigued, I experienced a sense of wonder, and it engaged my imagination. So if I were to choose 3 of those words, I'd get a score of 3 for fascination. So it's pretty simple in terms of scoring. I also wanted to note that the majority of these are positive because that's when visitors talk about their experience, they tend to talk about it in these positive ways. The one dimension that may be considered negative is the tension dimension, and that's made up of the words overloaded, stressed, tense, uncomfortable, and frustrated. And it may be considered negative, but there might be many museum experiences where tension is actually a really important part of the experience, but maybe perhaps needs to be resolved in some way throughout the experience. So I think an interesting question for research that I'd like to explore further is whether that, is it only the unresolved tension that shows up in the dove, or does any sort of tension elicited at any point in the experience show up in the dove? So that's something that I think would be interesting to look at further. And you all will be receiving after this a list of an example of the dove survey and how to score it, and also what these different dimensions mean. And I think, Vicki, you had some thoughts about this as well.
Yes, so the way that we looked at these dimensions, these different words and phrases, is from the results that we received. We actually, with the research we understand that behavior change is more likely by guests who feel a sense of awe or fascination, reflective engagement, and compassion. So knowing that and understanding that our goal is to have behavior change towards positive environmental skills that we want guests to have and elicit, we're then able to actually design exhibits that, design programs that actually help elicit those behaviors. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a couple of slides, but the idea is if we understand from these dimensions what actually could help cause a guest to change behavior, trying to almost reverse engineer a program to design that is really the way that we were using this tool, which has been fun.
Great. So now I want to share with you just a little bit more about how we've used the Dove at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. So we've mainly used it to evaluate our public programs. Others use it for every single exhibit at their organization to measure the overall visit experience, as well as compare staff and visitor reactions to an exhibit or program, which I think is a really neat way to use it to kind of understand what the staff intended and then what visitors actually experienced. But we've tended to use it so far in 3 ways that we found helpful for us. So one is that although it is casting this wide net, there are specific dimensions that we're really interested in eliciting. So we've measured when we know we're going to change a program to try to get to those dimensions. So we'll measure pre and post. And then we've also used it to compare across our programs in one exhibit so far to help us understand the strengths of each of our programs and to compare, which dimensions have the highest scores, and kind of that will spark some interesting conversations. And then what's really neat is that we can benchmark ourselves against other zoos and aquariums. Jan Packer, those who've used the tool will send Jan Packer their data, and she will send you back information about other zoos and aquariums or art museums, whatever institution you're in, and you can compare yourself to others in the field, which has been really useful. And so on the next slide, I'll show you some ways that we visualize this. So here is an example of how we might compare both our pre and post, but also comparing across different programs. So we on the x-axis are the Dove score, so the max score is 5, and the dimensions are on the y-axis. Here they're ordered from highest to lowest. And so we can see that both our penguin and our albatross encounter programs was highest in fascination and attention. However, albatross encounter was higher in compassion, and we also saw a change between 2016 and 2017. So I just wanted to show this as an example of, how we might talk about this with staff and then kind of spark conversations about, why it might be that, albatross encounter is higher in compassion, and why that changed between 2016 and 2017. And Vicki's going to talk more about that.
So as I mentioned, what's really interesting about this is if we understand that awe, fascination, compassion, and reflective engagement are kind of those dimensions that we're targeting, what we did was try to figure out if we could look at one of our programs, do a pre-study on it, test to see what those scores were for all of the dimensions, but specifically focused on those that we were hoping to increase, redesign the program, and then do a post-evaluation. And so the slide is showing you right now 2 of those areas with compassion and reflective engagement. And I want to specifically talk about our albatross program. And an albatross, for those of you who might not know, is a large seabird. It's an amazing, beautiful seabird. And the program that we used to run would be Makana is our albatross. That's the name of Makana. Or that's the name of the albatross. And she would come down around 1:30 every day. And the program that we would do with her was to talk about how she came to be here at the aquarium, to talk about how she survives in the wild, and to talk about the plight with plastic pollution and how it affects her, as well as her other seabirds, as well as just a lot of the animals in the ocean. And so that's the program that we were focusing on specifically to really change. But you'll also see kelp forest and penguin are in there as well. I'll talk about that in a moment. But the Makana program, the albatross encounter, in 2016, you can see the score is 1.87 for compassion and then 1.03 for reflective engagement. What we decided to do was try to see if we could increase that, move the needle on those specifically, and we did. And this is a couple ways in how we believe we did this. So specifically what we did was we added a monitor to our program, and that allowed us to share visual aids to tell the story of Makana specifically. It allowed us to show her photos of her as a chick, which, you know, sharing images of young animals, little baby animals, is always a way to elicit compassion. It allowed us to create more of a visual arc about her and tell her story from birth to where she came here to us and how that happened. And again, that elicits that vulnerability of an animal and the empathy that we're trying to increase on behalf of the guests. The other thing that we did was we changed the narrative to provide an opportunity on the focus of parent care. So the albatross parents are flying way out in the open ocean, searching for food, and they're gone for weeks on end, looking for food to bring back to their chick. And in most cases, they're bringing back pieces of plastic. So what we also tried to do is make sure that we changed some of the narrative to include perspective-taking language. So in the narrative, we use this phrasing that says, imagine you are an albatross parent searching for food for your young. And all of the programs say that. And this allows guests to connect deeper with the story of the albatross and the plight for food. Again, this was our hope to increase compassion by showing people that their animals that we're learning about are very similar to us and have those same exact needs that we do. And so we can try to increase that connection. And then finally, we were able to tell, using the visual assets again, a more comprehensive story of the scope of plastic pollution, why we started using plastic, when we started using plastic, and how it's kind of become out of control with our disposable plastic. And so we share that, but then more importantly, we share successes, things that we've done really well, focusing on banning the plastic bags, focusing on straw ban, those kind of things to mitigate plastic pollution. And again, in this storytelling type of format, we're increasing the reflective engagement. We're sharing a story that guests can then see themselves in. They can understand their own role in it and how they might be able to help in the future. So those were ways that we think it was highly likely that these changes in the program areas could have led to those increases in the scores. And the interesting thing about the kelp forest, because one of the questions we tend to get is if you're evaluating in 2016 and then you're evaluating in 2017 and you see an increase in those scores, which is what we were hoping to see, and kind of that reverse engineering on the program design, is you're going to be evaluating different people. And kelp forest was an interesting one because we had just redone that program, so we were not going to redesign it at all. So we thought it'd be a really good kind of control for us to study it in 2016 and then again study it in 2017. And our expectation was that they weren't going to change, and we can see that those pretty much stayed flat as well.
Great. And then this is one of my favorite ways that we can think about the dove. So as I mentioned, Jan Packer has a database of all the folks who've used the dove and sent her their data. And so here, if you look at the gray bar, that's her data for zoos and aquariums. So that's where 80% of the scores from zoos and aquariums lie. So we can consider that maybe a benchmark or even the norm for zoos and aquariums for that dimension. And then we can plot our programs against that norm. So you see our albatross encounter and our kelp forest. And so it's interesting for us to understand that our albatross encounter program is well above the norm, if we're considering that the norm, for listening compassion, as well as reflective engagement. And our kelp forest program is above the norm for eliciting fascination and aesthetic appreciation and attention. So then again, that can elicit interesting conversations. And it also is nice to feel like you're part of a community using this tool. I think this is a really useful feature as well for those just starting out to use the tool. Maybe you've only used it for a program or two, and so this really can help you to contextualize the information, so now you have something to compare it to better understand what's going on. And of course, you can also reach out to others who've used the tool too to kind of better understand, why they think they're seeing the things that they're seeing. So we also have talked about doing this for our own data now that we've pretty much used the dove at every one of our public programs. So we can create our own Monterey Bay Aquarium norm and replace that gray bar with our Monterey Bay Aquarium data. And so then we can compare every new program we survey or exhibit against our Monterey Bay Aquarium norm. And I also need to credit Nick Vischer of the Denver Zoo for coming up with this particular data visualization because it was a little tricky to figure out how to visualize this info. So I appreciate that he came up with this. And then next slide.
And then finally, we wanted to share some successes and challenges. We've been working with this instrument for a couple of years now, and I think one of the things that's been really helpful is just this overall shared language that we have. Primarily, it's a shared language between our evaluation team and our public programs team, which is great. If we talk about trying to elicit a certain behavior change or really focusing on some of these dimensions, it's very helpful for us to all understand, like, oh yeah, we know exactly what you're talking about when we're talking about reflective engagement, or that we want to increase reflective engagement. It's also really helpful as we're starting to use this to evaluate some of our exhibits as well, is that we now have shared language throughout the organization. We're slowly starting to build that too. So that's been very helpful. And then, as we mentioned, developing strategy, looking at the dimensions that are going to help reach an outcome that we're hoping for guests to have. In our case, it's behavior change, and understanding what dimensions kind of reach towards that behavior change with the awe, the compassion, the reflective engagement. And then sitting back and saying, how can we develop our programs? How can we develop a strategy to see if we can actually increase the scores on those? So that's been something that's been a really great success as well.
Great. And also in terms of shared language, I think a lot of times as an evaluator, you know, working with Vicki and others, you know, it used to be very popular to say that we want to create this emotional, right, this emotional experience or something like that. And it's been really great with the Dove for the developers to be able to get more specific about what kinds of emotions or introspective experiences you want to elicit, because the more specific you can get, the better we can look to the social science research for strategies on how to get to those particular emotions or cognitive experiences, those sorts of things. So it's been really useful that way. Another pro or success, I guess, of this is that it's an already validated instrument. So that's great that I didn't have to spend months testing and revising and retesting the instrument, that Jan and her colleagues have already done that. And that there is a range of people who've used it, and that you can reach out to various people to talk about your own successes and challenges with it. So that's great. The meaning aspect of it is both a success and challenge, or pro and con, in that it does present these words without context. So that allows it to be used across many different experiencing contexts and museums. But at the same time, because it's devoid of that context, visitors might be interpreting those words in different ways. So that could be a problem of it. Of course, no tool is perfect. It also is, has only been validated with adults 18 and older, and with English-speaking adults. So that's another challenge, is that it, you know, if we want to expand and look at other audiences, for instance, at the Monterey Aquarium, if we want to look at some of our Spanish-speaking audiences, we can't use this tool as of yet. And then the connection to outcomes piece has been a success and challenge as well, because we have done some work looking at, we have a theoretical model of how compassion might help us get to visitors wanting to do something differently for the ocean when they leave the aquarium. But that needs to be explored further. And we're also making a decision to look at the Dove to measure that immediate subjective experience, instead of maybe developing our own items to get at some program specific outcomes, learning and mission related. Of course, we've done both sometimes, but sometimes you don't have visitors for that long, and so you have to make a decision about what you're trying to measure. So that has been both a success and challenge. And we're also interested in your thoughts and questions about what you see as pros and cons of using this tool, or other questions you might have.
So as Jen mentioned, we are going to be sending out a Dove checklist and scoring sheet for you all. And so Lacey will be sending that out in an email, so you all have access to that. But please email Jan Packer. She's amazing and is always looking for people to have conversations about with evaluation, and also to get the scores so she can continue to build her resource library as well. And please feel free to email me if you have any questions or thoughts or want to see some of our evaluations. That's something that we're always very open to talking about and sharing. And with that, I just wanted to thank you all for taking the time, and I'm gonna let you look at this incredible octopus as it slowly sneaks across the screen. And I will stop sharing our screen so we can pass it back over to Lacey to see if we've got any questions or any comments that Jen and I would be happy to answer for you all. So thank you.
So I see that Maya has a question. I'll read it. So in using the Dove, I sometimes wonder about vocabulary. Have you done any testing with your audiences regarding familiarity with some of the vocabulary, self-actualization, aesthetic appreciation? So no, we haven't, because we have assumed that Jan and her colleagues have done extensive testing around this, although this has been, I'm assuming that's why you brought it up, Maya, is that this is something that is definitely a criticism of the tool, as some of the words do seem a little strange. And so for instance, I think something like, there's some words, so yeah, self-actualization, do people actually know what that means? So maybe they're not checking it because they just don't know what that word means, versus not actually being self-actualized because of the program. And there's a number of words, and Jan's actually in the process of revising the tool right now. I actually just completed a survey that she sent to people who use this on this very question: what words do you think need to be changed or aren't working, and other things, other dimensions that we might want to add to this and take away and stuff like that. So it is a tool that will maybe revamped at some point, and we might have a new Dove that we'll be using, and might be a new and improved Dove.
And one of the things too that I wanted to mention about that, when you started to think about the words, made me realize that when we look at this survey, there's a lot of words on it. And correct me if I'm wrong, Jen, but we did find out that people really enjoy filling out this survey. Oftentimes we find when you get a survey, sometimes people think it's a little bit laborious to do, but it sounds like from the folks who've been administering it, that people are really enjoying filling this out, which is kind of a different thing to hear when you're filling out a survey.
It takes about, on average, I'd say it takes about 5 minutes to fill out. And it does seem that visitors from, this is anecdotal, we haven't done a systematic study of how much they enjoy filling it out, but anecdotally they do seem to enjoy it. I think it's nice that it's different than a typical customer satisfaction survey people are used to filling out with a bunch of 1 to 10 or 1 to 7 scales. So I think it's kind of refreshing that it's a little different in that way.
That's great. I do see a question in the chat box. Vicki mentioned that behavior change is more likely when people feel a sense of awe, reflective engagement, and compassion. How did you all come to that conclusion?
Would you like me to answer that?
Yeah, I was gonna say, do you want to take that one, Jen?
So,
let the evaluator take that one.
Yeah, I think, it's based on theory. It's, for our particular context, I would say that we have some evidence for that those dimensions might lead, but we've so far only measured it in terms of asking people what they were inspired to do. Were they inspired, and what were they inspired to do? We haven't connected these dimensions to like a post-visit survey, like 6 months later or something. So we only know it in the context of the survey that we've used, where we ask immediately what people were inspired to do, and we have found some relationships between the fascination dimension, reflective engagement and compassion, and being inspired to do something. And we were interested in those dimensions to begin with because of some of the social science literature suggesting that if you get to compassion, it's obviously not deterministic. You may be more likely to want to do something. The fascination, maybe not so much, but there's some awe words in the fascination. So this is another thing. It'd be interesting to have a more robust measure of awe with the dove. But awe is about kind of the seeing yourself as a small part of something bigger. And so you can see how that might lend itself to being in this mindset for wanting to do something to help. It minimizes the self. And then reflective engagement is you're really thinking deeply about the experience. And so with our not for behavior change in general, because there's a lot of community-based things you can do to help people change their behavior that doesn't require them to reflect on their behavior. But for museum visits, I think there's some evidence that reflective engagement might be a necessary but not sufficient component of having people do something differently once they leave, because they're really reflecting deeply on what they experienced at the museum. Hopefully that made some sort of sense.
And I see one of the questions here asks about administering the surveys. If we administer them immediately after the program concludes, in person, or do you send it out digitally after their visit? And we administer them on site, and we do have them in a closed envelope that they get. And we hand it out prior to the program. And then, please correct me if I'm wrong, Jen. And we tell them to not open it. And if they do open it, then that survey is actually not used in the collection of the data. We have them watch the program and then fill that out afterwards and then hand it in to us.
Right, yes, so it is, it's immediately after they finish the program, we have them fill it out. And we had to end up giving it to them before the program started because we just couldn't get enough. It was too hard to get people people scatter after the program. Yeah. So that's kind of our procedure that we use for everything now. For all the programs, we'll give them the survey beforehand, and it's in the envelope, and we ask them not to look at it ahead of time.
And there's another question here that says, fascinating to see how zoos and aquariums can compare their responses. What recommendations do you have for other museum disciplines like art and history that may want to embark on a similar data collection effort? I will let Jen take that one too.
Yeah, I believe that there are a number of, and there might be some of you out in the audience who have used it. I'm not sure, but I think there have been a number of art museums that have used the tool, and so Jan Packer would have that data, and she would be able to give you the 80% for art museums. So we obviously, I know more about the zoos and aquariums because that's the data I asked for, but she has a wide range of museums have used this tool. So you'd be able to compare it to maybe the most similar type of museum to you.
And then Julia, there's another question saying, can you describe how you administered the survey? So we just mentioned how we did that, but your museum's just starting out and hasn't used an instrument like this. And that's what I think is so great about this instrument, is that it's already done. You don't have to do all the research to create a survey. But yes, making sure that we administered it on site was really the way that we wanted to make sure that we were getting the surveys back. And again, like Jen had mentioned, prior to the program, because right after the program, people scatter, they've got other things to do. So hopefully that answered it.
But for exhibits, it would be easier because you can just stand there and
yes,
randomly select people as they're exiting. I think it's also useful to have staff fill it out. And so even if you're not able to ask visitors to fill it out or you're not ready yet, I think it's interesting to have staff reflect on it. And I think that could spark some conversations as well. So I think it's useful for staff as well.
Mm-hmm. And then a follow-up question, Jen, this is one you can answer, is were there other tools you considered and decided against when you selected the Dove?
It was 2016, which seems like 20 years ago. Let's see, I think we were, how we actually ended up using it is that I think in conversation with Vicki and some other program staff learned that the Albatross Encounter program was going to be changing. Mm-hmm. And we thought, oh no, like we we want to have some evaluation of it before it changes, and it was sort of last minute for us. And I had heard of this tool, and so we thought, well, you know, we don't have time to develop our own instrument, so let's give this a try and see if it's useful for us. And staff really loved it, and so then we started, you know, using it for other programs. So that's how it happened.
And now we're using it for pretty much every
Right.
single program, which is really great, because then we can also do a lot of our own internal work on looking at how our programs, both in the feeding narrations as well as some of the auditorium, but like how they all kind of measure up towards each other, and what we've learned, some of the best practices that we've learned for the Makana program, the albatross encounter. If there were certain elements of it that actually helped elicit the scores that we were looking for, can we then look at some of our other programs and see if we can do some similar changes, and then, you know, pre-post study for that as well. I think it'll be really interesting, and this is just kind of like a sidetrack, but it'll be really interesting to see, since we understand that visitors really enjoy the feeding narrations in the public programs in this kind of new space that we're in, where we're not going to be offering those, to really kind of understand what the guest experience is moving forward, and is there any way for us to utilize this tool in the future. That might be a future session we can talk about years down the line, but would be really interesting to see kind of the guest experience that changes. So that'll be fun opportunity. Any other thoughts or questions for us?
Let's see.
From Katie.
How do you balance survey fatigue with using this tool to evaluate all your programs? So we haven't found much survey fatigue because, well, so any visitor would only fill it out once for one of our, and we typically, if we do have a number of, like when we did albatross encounter, kelp forest, and penguins, we had it at the same time, in terms of the same time frame that we were doing the survey. We would not, I can't remember what we did. I think we gave visitors stickers if they had already filled it out, so that we weren't resurveying them again. So, but I don't really see much survey fatigue with this particular survey, because it does seem to only take visitors like 5 minutes to complete. Hopefully that answered your question or what you were thinking about.
And then for Maya, have you, or are you aware of using the Dove to measure an overall museum visit? Interesting.
We have not, but I know others who have. So I know, for instance, the Denver Zoo uses it or has used it at the exit, and they did it. I think they wrote it up. I'm trying to remember what article they wrote it up their experience in, but they used it as an exit survey, and then they got the Washed Ashore exhibit at the zoo, which is it's like plastic art made from plastic. And then they kind of did it again, and they saw an increase in reflective engagement, which is what we might predict based on what we know about reflective engagement. So it's kind of like it's evidence that that exhibit had influenced the whole exhibit experience. So I thought that was pretty neat that they found that.
Great.
Well, unless anyone else sends in any questions, which we have plenty of time for. So if you're out in the audience, if you still have questions or comments that you want to share, feel free to send them in. But in the meantime, I just wanted to thank you, Jen and Vicki, so much for sharing this, sharing your learning with this tool and how you use it, and with CAM's audience. Again.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for giving us the opportunity. It's a lot of fun to be able to share this.
Yeah, and we can't wait to hear, you know, if it evolves, how it evolves as we move forward.
So there's a question: how do we get access to the tool? So we, Lacey, I think we'll be sending you an email with our handout that we gave at the CAM conference that has the tool. But I would really, it's in PDF because I really want folks who use it to reach out to Jan Packer. She's very responsive, and just so she knows who's using it, and she can help answer any questions that you have too. So I would really encourage you to email Jan if you're interested in more information and getting access to the tool.
And we can send out Jan's email address again in the post email as well. Mentioning that the tool is so far in English language only, are you aware of any efforts to translate and test the instrument in other languages?
I am not aware of any efforts yet to do that. I think the focus right now is on refining the language as it is now in English. So I don't know if anyone's working on translating it, but that would be really neat if they were.
Right. It'd be so great.
Yes.
And I'm happy to include Jan's email address in the follow-up email. I think I see it in your slide, so I can share that. While we are still on, and again, people are more than welcome to continue sending in questions. I will, if you don't mind, just share one final word from Cam, which is that we have one more of these Lunch and Learn programs. We are so grateful for all of you who have attended multiple and who have participated today. This has been such a great series. We're so grateful to all our speakers, particularly Jen and Vicki today. And we have one more next week, is our final CAM fellow presenting her case study about museums as second responders. So I encourage all of you to go to our website, calmuseums.org/lunchlearn, and register for that. It is free, and join us again next week. Well, if there's we can call it. Thank you both so much again for your presentation today, and taking the time to share your knowledge with us.
Of course. Thank you. Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.